And welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at The End of History, where we help believers make sense of the world they live in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built these times. Now, we are looking at a history series. We are currently, I think this is episode 15. We're looking at the history of the Empire, a 250-year American story. And so we are looking, well, in our last episode, we saw the American Revolution beginning to move towards its closing phase. And as promised, we are today turning now to the decisions, the events that helped keep the new American nation from going down the path that most other revolutions tend to take. And revolutions have kind of a dark track record when you look at world history. So we're going to look and see what changed or what was different with the American Revolution, and that's what we'll start looking at today. You can always learn more at theendofhistory.net, find more essays, articles, other podcast series, all of that good stuff when you go to theendofhistory.net. Thanks for listening, everyone.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So one of the reasons that U.S. policy has opposed revolutions in other nations, despite the fact that we were born from our own revolutions, it's because of how damaging, how destructive revolutions can be. I say can be. I mean, they usually are. Revolutions upend the world order for nations, for nations connected to those nations, and that chaos, that tumult ripples. It really has a ripple effect throughout the global and economic system that those nations are connected to. The historical norm when it comes to revolution is for things to get way out of hand. And the original ideals, no matter how high and lofty they may have been, well, they usually get swallowed up. They usually get destroyed. Think about it for a minute. You've got the French Revolution. This happened just a few years after the American Revolution. It resulted in 17,000 to 40,000 executions, not war, executions. The Russian Revolution, which happened near the end of World War I, was so destructive, they have a hard time breaking down how many were actually killed as a result of the revolution or the civil war that followed. Like, it's hard to distinguish between the two. It's probably in the hundreds of thousands. You've got the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It resulted in 1 to 2 million deaths. The Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979 saw probably 60,000 people killed in the revolution there. It's almost a universal law in geopolitics. Revolutions bring chaos and violence. We like to think that those revolutions were different than the American one, right? Those people are different. Those people over there, they're different than us, but they aren't. The same story was just as likely to have played out in America with its revolution as what played out in these other nations over the course of history. People are just as dark, just as corrupt here as they are there. Anyone who tells you differently is trying to sell you something that usually involves your loyalty. We already saw in our last episode how the Continental Association helped legitimize the Continental Congress by shaming anyone who opposed the ideals of the revolution. We also saw how in many areas people were carrying out their own agendas in the name of the revolution's ideals. They were settling scores. They were upending the social order. They were finding their way to the top of the pile. And it's very likely that all of this might have continued. It might have gotten completely out of control, causing the American Revolution to be really a complete failure, as many Europeans believed at the time that it would be, except for what happened next. When George Washington resigned his commission before Congress in Annapolis on December 23, 1783, right at the end of the war, he performed an act so unexpected, so countercultural, that it reverberated across continents. And this is the moment, not the peace treaties or the British surrender, that really serves as an end to the fighting in the Revolution. Americans had just won a war for independence against the most powerful empire on earth. Their commander, universally admired, politically unchallenged, and backed by an army that adored him. He could easily have just seized power right then, and many expected him to do that. Some even hoped he would. But instead, George Washington walked away. For all of Washington's faults, and history has shown there were many, but this moment, this undeniable strength of character that supported his decision in this moment are what made him the most important figure in the American Revolution. History is full of revolutions, full of civil wars, where great leaders lead a great cause to victory only to be tempted by the power, to be tempted into taking control of their nation at the end of the story. Those stories, I guess they almost always turn out bad. I can't think of a good example where it doesn't turn out bad. We can look at these examples even around the modern world today and see this in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. What Washington did here was shocking to the Americans, and it was shocking to the rest of the world. The historian Joseph Ellis, describing the speech in the moment of Washington's resignation in his book, The Cause, he writes these words. He says, "He ended succinctly but melodramatically with words that had Jeffersonian overtones. Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding farewell to the august body under whom I have long acted, I offer here my commission, and take leave of all the employments of public life." He then walked straight to the door behind his aides while the applause was still ringing, mounted Nelson, his horse, and rode toward Mount Vernon with Billy Lee, his slave, by his side. It was the greatest exit, perhaps the most consequential moment in American history. Jefferson understood what he had just witnessed. Thomas Jefferson is watching this. The moderation and character, this is what Jefferson wrote, the moderation and character of a single man, he wrote a friend, has probably prevented the revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by its subversion of the liberty it was intended to establish. Jefferson was thinking of Caesar and Cromwell. If he had access to a crystal ball, he could have mentioned Napoleon, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Castro, and a host of African dictators. End of quote. For Americans, Washington's resignation was a profound reassurance at a moment of deep uncertainty. The revolution had been won, but the new nation was still fragile. It was financially broke, politically divided. Many feared that the Continental Army, unpaid and restless, might become a political force in its own right. And Washington's decision to relinquish power here signaled that the military would remain subordinate to civilian authority. It also validated the revolution's ideals. Americans were convinced they had fought not merely for independence, but for a republic, grounded in virtue, grounded in restraint. And Washington's departure literally embodied those principles. Ordinary citizens saw in him a leader who refused the temptations of personal glory. Elites, many of those who feared the rise of a new Caesar in the person of George Washington, they breathed a sigh of relief right here. And this act by George Washington, it really helped stabilize the political climate and strengthen the legitimacy of the fledgling Confederation Congress. Now, this is a story we'll see a few more times in the story of the American Empire as we go through in future episodes. In many instances, and this is important to keep in mind, important to remember, in many instances, definitely not all, but in many instances, the greatest gift some leaders have given is to resist, to walk away from power when they could have taken it. This is what made the system work. It's what made it strong. Washington was the first to do that. Even the nations and rulers of Europe were stunned. Monarchs and ministers simply couldn't fathom a victorious general like Washington surrendering power voluntarily. King George III in Britain heard about it and he didn't believe it. The British king reportedly said that if Washington truly retired and returned to private life, he would be, and this is a quote from King George III, the greatest man in the world. To European observers, steeped in centuries of dynastic rule, Washington's resignation was not just unusual, it was revolutionary. This was like a revolution on top of the revolution. Philosophers in France celebrated it as proof that republican virtue was possible in the modern world. British commentators, though wary of American independence, they admired the gesture as a rebuke to tyranny. Across the continent, Washington became a symbol of enlightened leadership, a living contradiction to the assumption that power inevitably corrupts. Had Washington chosen differently, the United States might have followed the path of so many post-revolutionary societies. Military rule, charismatic dictatorship, or a new monarchy. The Army's loyalty to him was unquestioned. The political institutions of the 1780s, as the war ended, they were weak. A single ambitious decision could have reshaped the continent. And by resigning, Washington set a precedent that power and the American system must be temporary, must be accountable, must be subordinate to law. And this act became the moral foundation for his later decision to step down again after 2 presidential terms, another voluntary surrender that cemented the norm of peaceful transitions into the American system. Washington's resignation obviously didn't guarantee American democracy, but it did make it possible. It created a political culture that distrusted concentrated power, that revered civic virtue. It taught Americans, taught the watching world, that leadership could be defined not by how much authority one accumulates, but how willingly one gives it up. And so in that quiet Annapolis chamber, Washington didn't just end a military career that day. He shaped the political imagination of a nation that, he set the United States on a trajectory toward Republican self-government rather than the more familiar patterns of empire and autocracy. Now, as dramatic and pivotal as it was, though, Washington's resignation didn't change the facts on the ground. The country was still broke. They were really just a disorganized mess at the end of the Revolution. The country was. The colonies had secured their independence, but they were still not a nation yet. A big reason for that, that codifying reason for that was the plan for the government that the leaders of that country had developed, the Articles of Confederation. This was the governing document for the new nation at the time. The Articles of Confederation emerged from the crucible of the American Revolution, crafted by a generation of political thinkers who were attempting something unprecedented. They were building a national government in the middle of a war for independence. And so their creation was not the work of a single mind. It was the product of a committee, a Congress, and a political culture deeply suspicious at the same time of centralized authority. Right? So the articles reflected the ideals, the fears, and the improvisational spirit of the revolutionary moment from the war itself. And for that very reason, the Articles of Confederation, they quickly proved inadequate once the independence was won. Way back in 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee just days before approving the Declaration of Independence. The committee was appointed to draft a plan for a national government. The committee's chair, John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, he was one of the most thoughtful constitutional minds of the era. Dickinson's initial draft envisioned a relatively strong central authority, including the power to tax, the power to regulate Western lands. But Congress, steeped in the political culture of colonial self-rule, wary of anything resembling Parliament, they stripped out a lot of Dickinson's stronger provisions that he had included in the Articles. Other influential voices shaped the final product. You had Benjamin Franklin. He had earlier proposed a loose Confederation plan. And although his ideas weren't adopted wholesale, they influenced the committee's thinking. Samuel Adams, Elbridge Gerry, and other New England delegates, they pushed for a strong state sovereignty. Thomas Jefferson, though not directly involved in drafting the Articles, he contributed to the broader ideological environment that really emphasized local control and Republican virtue. The final version of this governing document, approved by Congress in 1777, ratified by all 13 states in 1781, again, while the war is going on, it was a compromise, really just a compromise between these competing visions, but it leaned real heavily toward decentralization. The Articles of Confederation were built around a single overriding purpose: to preserve the independence and sovereignty of each of the new states while coordinating their efforts in the war against Britain. Now think about that for a second. They wanted to preserve the independence of each state, and it was meant to coordinate their working together. Just to coordinate, not really centralize their working together. In other words, the Articles of Confederation were designed really for the revolutionary mindset, and not for a new nation or whatever was to follow the revolution. The new national government was intentionally weak. It consisted of a unicameral Congress in which each state, regardless of population, had one vote. There was no executive branch, no national judiciary, no independent enforcement power. Congress could conduct diplomacy, wage war, make peace, manage Western territories, coin money, resolve disputes between the states, but it could not levy taxes, could not regulate interstate or foreign commerce, could not enforce its own laws, could not compel states to contribute troops or funds. That's a problem, right there. This structure reflected the colonists' recent experience with British imperial authority. The fear of centralized power was so strong that the states preferred the risk of national weakness to the possibility of another distant, unaccountable government. And this system was obviously doomed to failure. But the Articles of Confederation didn't fail because they were poorly designed. They failed because they were designed for a world that no longer existed after the Revolution. The system worked tolerably during the war. I mean, they got away with it during the war. It wasn't great, but they got away with it. But when the shared threat of British power disappeared, once peace arrived, the centrifugal force of state sovereignty overwhelmed the fragile bonds of union. And this is important to recognize, not only for what immediately follows in the story, but also because some of these philosophical debates would linger all the way to the American Civil War. These ideas of a decentralized authority, of states' rights, things like that, these are going to echo. They're going to be held as value statements for many, even of the signers of what would eventually be the Constitution. Consider just some of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The Confederation Congress, like I said, had no power to tax. It could only request money from the states, and those states obviously often refused. The national government accumulated massive debts from the war. They owed money to foreign creditors. They couldn't pay soldiers or maintain a stable currency, so inflation soared. States printed their own money, often irresponsibly, creating this patchwork of competing currencies that undermined economic stability. If you traveled from New York to Georgia, you might have to convert your money multiple times. So trade was just really hampered with this. Because Congress lacked authority over commerce, states pursued their own economic policies, often at the expense of their neighbors. They imposed tariffs on one another's goods, competed for foreign trade advantages. They engaged in retaliatory measures that resembled the behavior of independent nations rather than independent states and members of a union. Products moving from Massachusetts to New York could be taxed by New York and then taxed by Massachusetts when they went back. And alongside that, either of those states could make a private treaty or a deal with any other foreign power. So the resulting economic chaos convinced many leaders, including George Washington, including James Madison, that the Confederation was incapable of managing a continental economy. Now, European powers, European nations, they quickly recognized the Confederation's weakness. Britain, after making a peace deal with the Americans, ultimately refused to even evacuate different forts in the Northwest Territory. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American navigation, and foreign nations doubted the United States' ability to enforce treaties. Without a strong executive or unified diplomatic policy, this young nation struggled to command respect abroad. In his book, American Revolutions, the historian Alan Taylor, he writes, independence also deprived the United States of protection by the Royal Navy, which had secured colonial access to dangerous markets in the Mediterranean. Without that protection, merchant ships fell prey to Muslim pirates operating from the Barbary coast of North Africa. Barbary's rulers offered to sell protection or tribute payments, which Congress could no more afford to pay than it could afford a proper navy. Taylor adds, the same historian, he adds, weak and diffuse, the American Union had become a diplomatic joke in Europe. Posted as a diplomat in Paris, Thomas Jefferson reported that the Europeans supposed everything in America was anarchy, tumult, and civil war. The most dramatic sign of the Article's failure came with this event called Shays' Rebellion, 1786, 5 years after the Revolution. This event erupted in western Massachusetts at a moment when the young United States was struggling to define its post-revolution identity. Small in scale, this event still became one of the most consequential domestic crises of the era. The rebellion Shays' Rebellion grew out of severe economic pressures facing rural farmers. After the Revolution, Massachusetts imposed these high taxes, insisted on hard currency, and aggressively pursued debt collection. So many farmers, already operating in a subsistence economy, they found themselves unable to pay the taxes. The result was a wave of foreclosures, of lawsuits, and even imprisonment for debt. These policies hit western Massachusetts hardest, where cash was scarce, where economic recovery lagged behind the coastal commercial centers. Farmers believed the state government, dominated by Eastern merchants, were indifferent to their suffering. And they demanded some tax relief, the issuance of paper money, reforms to the court system. And when those petitions failed, they turned to direct action. The insurgents called themselves regulators. This was echoing earlier colonial protest movements. And although the rebellion bears his name, Daniel Shays, he's this former Continental Army captain. He was only one of several leaders, okay? But it's named after him. Shays emerged as really a symbolic figure because he led several dramatic actions, including the attempt to shut down courts and halt foreclosures. Nothing wrong with that, you would think, right? He's just trying to shut down these courts from taking these farmers' lands, to halt the foreclosures. Keep in mind, this guy was a captain in the Continental Army, the army that had just fought against the British Empire for a cause quite closely related to what was happening now. That was the way Shays and his comrades saw it anyway. Didn't they just fight a war for the cause of taxation without representation, for the rights to life, liberty, and property? Weren't they entitled to, at least, the philosophical spoils of that war? In 1786, armed groups forced the closure of county courts in several counties in Massachusetts, and their goal was simple. If courts couldn't meet, they couldn't process foreclosure or imprison debtors. Well, the state government viewed the uprising as a direct threat to Republican order. And because the Confederation Congress lacked funds, lacked the authority to intervene, Massachusetts had to act alone. They raised a privately funded militia of about 4,400 men under General Benjamin Lincoln and General William Shepard. They commanded state forces defending the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. Well, the climactic moment came in January 1787. Shays led roughly 1,200 men in an assault on the Springfield Armory. Shepard's militia fired grape shot, repelling the attack. Lincoln's forces then pursued the rebels, defeating them at Petersham in early February. Shays fled to Vermont, and most insurgents, after conviction, they accepted amnesty. The rebellion was put down. But across the nation, this is what's important, Shays' rebellion sparked widespread alarm. Many Americans saw the uprising as evidence that the revolution's promise was unraveling. If a state could not maintain order, or if the citizens could take up arms against their own courts, what did that say about the stability of the republic itself? The Connecticut educator Noah Webster, he wrote an essay around this time stating, "For my own part, I confess, I was once as strong a Republican as any man in America. Now a republic is among the last kinds of government I should choose. I would infinitely prefer a limited monarchy, for I would sooner be subject to the caprice of one man than to the ignorance and passions of the multitude." A lot of people were feeling this way. This sentiment was not felt by Webster alone. Across the nation, a split perspective was developing. Although it took different forms in the details, a growing half of the newly independent nation was defiant and insisting on the ideals of independence, even if it meant a level of chaos and anarchy, while a growing half of the other part of the people in the nation were thinking that a return to homegrown monarchical rule of some type was just necessary to ensure peace and stability in the country. And that first group was included men like Thomas Jefferson. Many might be familiar with this famous quote by Jefferson where he talks about the tree of liberty being refreshed with the blood of tyrants. I've seen this literally on bumper stickers of modern-day patriots and Tea Party warriors in recent years. Shays' rebellion was the actual context of the quote, though. He wasn't talking about the British. Jefferson was writing a letter to a friend who was alarmed about the breakdown of the government in the new nation. And this is part of what Jefferson wrote back. He wrote, "And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts, and in the spur of the moment, they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order." Very verbose in that whole statement, but that's the context of what he was talking about. He was talking about Shays' rebellion. It's okay for some people to be killed for all of this. The tree of liberty has to be refreshed with the blood of tyrants. That was Jefferson's perspective. We're going to see, as this series goes forward, that the myth of Jefferson was quite different from the actual historical Jefferson. We're going to come to that. For now, America's Confederation Congress's inability to raise troops or funds to assist Massachusetts was especially troubling for those most concerned about the potential collapse of the new nation. Observers concluded that the national government was dangerously weak. The rebellion became a powerful argument for strengthening federal authority, and it was frequently cited by leaders like George Washington, like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, as proof that the Articles of Confederation, they're failing, all right? This wasn't working. Although the Shays' rebellion was quickly suppressed, its political impact is really, it's enormous, it's important. Whispers among the political leadership of the new states began to slowly tilt toward recognizing the need for a new constitutional convention. The situation was becoming critical. At its core, the Articles of Confederation created a government that could deliberate but not act. It could recommend but not enforce. It could request, it couldn't require. And the states retained all meaningful sovereignty. The national government existed only at the state's pleasure. So this structure might have worked for a loose alliance. I guess it did work. It worked for a loose alliance of small republics during wartime. But it was wholly inadequate for this vast, diverse, and rapidly expanding nation. The Articles failed because they were built on a revolutionary logic, fear of centralized authority that couldn't sustain a functioning nation state. Returning again to his book, The Cause, the historian Joseph Ellis, this is what he writes. He says, the Articles were distinctive in declaring what the new Confederation Congress could not do. And the cogent summary of one historian, it could not pass effective laws or enforce its order. It could ask for money but not compel payments. It could enter into treaties but not enforce their stipulations. It could provide for the raising of armies but not fill the ranks or provide for repayment. It could advise and recommend but not command. It was designed to be weak because weakness was what the vast majority of Americans wanted at the federal level, lest they create a domestic vision of Parliament which they were rebelling against. From the perspective of ordinary Americans who lived and died locally, the Confederation Congress was a foreign government. Its inadequacy was reassuring. The realities of independence after the Revolution, though, demanded a stronger, more coherent national government, one capable of managing commerce, of enforcing laws, of maintaining security, and speaking with a single voice abroad. This is when a few leading voices began to move behind the scenes to work towards that change. By this point, the United States looked less like a nation and more like a loose collection of quarreling states held together by hope, by habit, and the flimsy Articles. But behind the scenes, a small circle of determined leaders began to whisper. They began to write one another. They began to maneuver towards something radical. And what was radical was replacing the Articles entirely. It wasn't a conspiracy in the sinister sense. It was more like a quiet, strategic coordination among men who believed the republic was slipping towards chaos, maybe even collapse. And it's to that circle of conspirators that we're going to turn in our next episode. Many believed that these men coordinated and pulled off. What they coordinated and pulled off at the time was no less than a second American Revolution. In fact, it may have been. We're going to turn to that story in our next episode in this series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.B. Shreve, and you're listening to the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of the world they're living in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of our times and the history that built those times. Be sure to check us out at theendofhistory.net and jbshreve.com.